welcome to History Goes Graphic, a San Diego Comic-Con panel that explores adapting history into the graphic novel format. I'm Caitlin Ketchum, Associate Editorial Director at 10 Speed Press, and I'm really excited to talk to our panelists, all of whom are authors who have written nonfiction graphic novels about cultural history and pastimes, historical figures and movements, and autobiography and family history. We are joined today by Mikki Kendall, author of Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists, Tom Scioli, author of the forthcoming Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, Malika Gharib, author of I Was Their American Dream, David F. Walker, author of The Life of Frederick Douglass and the forthcoming The Black Panther Party, and Fred Van Lente, author of the forthcoming The Comic Book Story of Basketball. Hey guys, welcome.
Hi. Hello.
Hey.
Good to see you all here.
I'm marveling at everybody's like titles because I'm like, yeah, this is so cool to be here.
I'm
Absolutely.
so glad to have you all here and to get this opportunity to talk to you and to share more with the world about the work that you do. So we're going to take a moment before we begin with questions for our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and then dive into some more questions. So maybe I'll just call on you guys since it's hard to read social cues here on the Zoom. So David, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I wrote the Life of Frederick Douglass, which came out through 10 Speed Press in January. I think it was January 2019, and in 2021, I've got the Black Panther Party coming up, and also through 10 Speed. And I'm just grappling with the fact that I've really fallen in love with nonfiction graphic novels or whatever we want to call them, since they're slightly different than the more traditional comics. But I think I found my home.
Awesome.
Yay.
Yay. Malika, over to you.
Sure. My name is Malika Gharib. I wrote my first book ever last year, a graphic memoir called I Was Their American Dream. It's about being first generation Filipino Egyptian American, and it kind of just sort of follows my journey into decolonizing myself, becoming more woke into the person who I am. And yeah, now I'm just doing a lot of other comics. I'm a journalist by day. I also make a lot of zines and just making little spot comics here and there. Nice to be here.
Great. Tom, you're up.
Yeah, the book I'm doing for 10 Speed is Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, and it's the story of Jack Kirby's life. He's the co-creator of like most of the Marvel characters and a lot of characters for DC also, and it's my first nonfiction graphic novel. Prior to that, I did comic books. The thing I did just before this was called Fantastic Four Grand Design, where I was basically doing like a big Fantastic Four story based on Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's concepts. So there's like that was like a nice bridge from like my previous sort of science fiction and escapist work into this like very Kirby specific thing. Still being biographical, but about a subject that I know a lot.
Fantastic. Mikki.
Hi, I'm Mikki Kendall. I wrote Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists for 10 Speed. I also wrote Hood Feminism, handily displayed behind me. No, I really love comics, and I have found my niche for the things that maybe don't fit into prose or don't necessarily, because there's something really great about seeing kids who want to learn have a way to learn that is fun for them. I want them to enjoy what they're reading and enjoy learning about history, as opposed to being like, why am I seeing this list of dates for the 18th time?
And Fred.
Yeah, I've been doing nonfiction comics since 2003. God, I'm so old. I started with Action Philosophers, which was about philosophy. I did the comic history of comics. Today, in fact, I have two books coming out from Harper Kids called Action Presidents. They're on Theodore Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. And right now, and all those were with my pal Ryan Dunleavy. Right now, we're working on a book called The Comic Book History of Animation. And in September, I'll be doing the comic book story of basketball because I already was not already all over the place with my subject matter. We just thought we'd go even crazier.
Do you ever sleep?
No.
Yeah.
What, sleep? What?
Yeah.
That's where I'm a Viking. That's right.
I mean, some of you touched on this in your introductions. Thank you all so much for giving us that background on yourselves and your work. I'm curious and some of you did touch on this, what drew you to wanting to write about history? Some of you talked about working in nonfiction versus writing fiction, but what about history, biography, sort of personal memoir narrative drew you to, this format?
Go first, I guess. I could do
Great.
that. Well, I had been thinking about doing nonfiction for a long time. Was doing work at Marvel and DC and companies like that, and it was sort of on my bucket list. And I had a couple of topics I wanted to do, and then I was contacted by Patrick Barb, who at the time was an editor at 10 Speed, and he asked me if I'd be interested in doing anything nonfiction, and I said yes. And then he said Frederick Douglass, and my first thought was, I don't know enough about Frederick Douglass, but I come from a journalism background, and I wrote a lot of papers in college, so I know how to do research. So I figured I would dive in, and I think this, for me, the thing that I love about, and Mickey was sort of touching upon this a moment ago. Like as a kid, I was more of a visual learner. I loved comics, and if I looked at a book with a big block of text when I was a kid, it would freak me out. And so I would kind of steer clear. And if there's a lot of pictures, I would get into it. And I know that there's a lot of other kids like that out there, and there's adults like that out there too. And so part of what I love about this medium, which is really emerging more and growing, is that it provides an opportunity to, at the very least, provide like an entry point. I know I've heard from a lot of teachers and librarians about the Frederick Douglass book, that they're all like, finally there's something that you can crack into, because some of the best books about Frederick Douglass were like 800-900 pages with no pictures, right? Like who makes a book with no pictures? That's like blasphemy. So, but that's what I've always been kind of a history nerdy kid, and I'm probably older than Fred, and I used to sit in my grandparents' house and just read the encyclopedia. I loved reading about real life stuff, and so that opportunity to share knowledge is, I just think it's super fun and cool.
And now to piggyback off of that, I actually, even though I was nerdy, my nickname was books, and I liked to read, I thought I didn't like history. I, for years, thought history was super boring. And then I got to college and found out that history could be interesting and fun and could be the story of the world. So when this came up, what I really wanted to do was tell the history of women's fight for their rights, but instead of it being like this tiny sliver, which is how we usually learn history, we always learn things sort of divorced from all context. This is the only medium I could think of where you could go from 4000 BC to the near future and put in pretty colors. And I'm 12. Emotionally, when it comes to comics, I'm 12 forever. You'll do. And put in pretty colors and then make it a lot of fun. Like have this roller coaster ride, right? Where we threw in time travel and an AI and the distinct concrete facts, so that kids would feel like they were kind of in Magic School Bus meets Doctor Who meets the history class they never got in the first place. And so for me, this was the perfect medium to turn loose all of that sort of frustrated doodling in history class creativity.
Sure. For me, I guess I always thought of comics as like the way that I express myself and sort of sort out my feelings, whether I'm happy or sad or really frustrated. I've been doing that ever since I was a kid, just making drawings of myself and like, God, I hate this class. It's just doing that on the sidelines of my notebooks. And when in 2016, when I started seeing all this like anti-immigrant rhetoric in the news, I just did the same thing. I turned to drawing comics about things that I was trying to make sense of. Hearing things like immigrants just want to come to this country and take our jobs, and immigrants are terrorists. And I felt like I wanted to produce a counter narrative of the things that I knew to sort of help correct those narratives that I was seeing. So for example, Arabs are terrorists. I drew this cartoon about my dad and how he likes Tom Hanks and gardening and like denim shorts, and he likes KFC, and he's not like what, I don't know, what was being said at the time. And that collection of comics, I think I just kept, you know, as you draw, you're sort of exploring yourself and getting deeper and deeper into this, into trying to figure out what you're trying to say. And I couldn't stop drawing these comics on this theme. I had never really written or thought about race or immigrants in my life before. I'm Filipino Egyptian. I don't know why I haven't, but I just hadn't. And all of a sudden I had like maybe 100 comics about that topic. And then, you know, Clarkson Potter came along and we turned it into a book. But yeah, I never imagined that I would write about my personal history. I was just inspired at the time, and comics were the right medium to do it.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean,
Oh, after you,
yeah.
Tom.
No, just you know, just talking about comics, I'm just like immersed in comics. Like comics is my world, and then sort of like specifically those like, you know, the Marvel, DC, like Jack Kirby kind of comics. And just from like an early age, I studied his work. Like I you know, loved what Jack Kirby did, and I wanted to figure out how he did it. It just seemed like so you know, strange and amazing to me. And I just, you know, studied his work, studied his life, all these, you know, all these things, and then incorporated it into my own work. And then you know, as the years went on, I sort of like just became like an expert in it, just from all those years of like studying his stuff so closely, and so telling his story just made so much sense. And like I felt like it was a story that's due, that like people are ready to hear. Like those movies, you know, we were just like coming off of you know, the end of like all those Avengers movies, and you know, like 90% of the characters you see there, he like either, you know, co-created or created. And his name is well known within comic circles, and almost to the point where it's like, oh well, yeah, everybody knows who Jack Kirby is. But no, if you just take like one step out of there, you know, the people who you know, have the Avengers lunchbox or go to these movies, might not know. They know Stan Lee. Stan Lee is like very well represented and upfront, but Jack Kirby was just, you know, so important to these things, you know, as important as Stan, possibly more important than Stan. And he's just sort of this like invisible presence. So you know, I wanted to sort of bring him into the foreground more. And you know, comics is what I do. If I were a filmmaker, I'd make a movie. If I made video games, I'd make a video game about it, but I made comics. So this is the way I told his story.
Yeah, to please my parents, I went to graduate school rather than go try to break into the comic book industry with my buddies that we were making comics in undergrad. And I really hated it. I did English lit, but you had to teach as a TA, so I did sort of enjoy like explaining things. Like I did Freud in 45 minutes and Marx in 45 minutes, and the students seemed to really respond to that. Because I'm a very good, I have a talent for explaining. Like that's something that is very specific, you know, like the Liam Neeson Taken. I have a very specific set of skills, and that's okay. I have one skill and that's it, and it's pretty good. But so I sold something to Malibu Comics when I was still at grad school. For those of you out there who remember Malibu Comics, and I was like, this is easy. Doing comics, breaking into comics is easy. So I quit my job. I left Pittsburgh, actually, the University of Pittsburgh, which is where I was going at the time. And I moved to New York, and then Malibu got shut down, things canceled. It was just a total disaster. So my friends and I kind of bummed around a little bit longer trying to break into comics. And at one point, SPX, which is this terrific convention down in DC, did an anthology, and one year there, we were trying to get into it, and our anthology was there. The theme of the anthology was biography. So I was reading Nietzsche in the time because that's who I was in my 20s. And I thought it'd be funny to do a funny comic strip about Nietzsche, as if, like, you know, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, you got little comics with your action figures. I thought it'd be fun to do a little comic book as if that's what you got with your Nietzsche action figure. And that's hence the term action philosophers. And so Ryan and I did that, and we got rejected from SPX. And then we sent it out to a bunch of independent publishers and got rejected from everyone. But then the Xeric Foundation, which was this foundation that Peter Laird, co-creator of the Teenage Mutant Turtles, set up back when breaking into comics meant print, they gave you money to self-publish your own comics. And so we got a grant to do Action Philosophers, and we thought, you know, we'll come out with an issue, and that's fine, and Dandy will get a book deal or something out of it. But lo and behold, to our shock, people really like nonfiction comics, and this was 2005, I think, by this point. And I just haven't stopped doing it. It's so much fun, and I relearned the joy that I had, the joy that I got from doing teaching. I sort of relearned by doing this and teaching everyone all over the world various strange things through comics. It's very rewarding.
Awesome. Thank you all. It's so interesting to hear about your different pathways to this. And on that note, I'm curious to sort of explore, since we are talking about a visual format, I'd love to hear more about how you each approach the art in your books. I thought we might start with Fred and Mickey and David, just since you guys usually work with artists, and then we can, Malika and Tom can talk a little bit about, you know, doing both. So I'm just curious, you know, for you, Fred and Mickey and David, when you're working with artists, how much planning and thinking about the art are you doing as you write? How closely are you collaborating with those artists? And how does this kind of all come together in your brain as you work?
So for me, because my brain is a mess, I fortunately have been lucky to work with some very patient artists who will accept the fact that I work off reference materials to describe things. So I have a Slack channel where I put in like the links that I'm thinking of, the images that I'm thinking of. And then sometimes an artist tells me that there are too many actions in this panel. And sometimes they say things like, why do we need the ziggurat and the, okay. But we have a lot of communication. We have a lot of conversation, and I try to build in enough time and references so that we're not having I was thinking of this thing and you drew something completely different. So if anything, I overshare up front what's in my head so that we can sort of scale back the giant blockbuster movie that I would like to cram into a 3x5 square.
Awesome.
Well, for me, it's in doing the nonfiction stuff, it's a combination of trying to think about, well, how do you adapt a person's life into comic format? What are key moments that are interesting? Could they be represented visually? And then it's also about compiling as much reference material as possible, and then sharing that with the artist. And in both the Frederick Douglass book and the Black Panther Party book, there's a lot of communication between myself and the artist. There was a lot of, even more so with Black Panther Party, Marcus, the artist, we probably communicate twice a week or so. And there's, if there's something that I didn't find reference of, he asks me like 2 days in advance. He'll say, hey, there's no picture of this particular person, and I'm going to be on that page 2 days from now. Can you help me find it? And then that way it's never a big rush. And it's kind of difficult because when you're doing this nonfiction stuff, it's not like you're writing a Batman adventure, you know, there's no punching the Joker or anything like that. And so I think a lot of it is, you know, just making sure, and a lot of these books are text heavy too. And a lot of artists aren't used to accommodating that much text there's probably like 2 to 3 times more text than there is in a regular comic, which is cool, but can also throw an artist off. You know, there's a lot of me telling, and I'll say in the script, you know, at the top of a panel description, this is a text heavy section. We don't need to see the background. We don't need to see, you know, all the books on the shelf or whatever. So, but it's for me, the big challenge is like, if I can't figure out what it should look like or how it could be drawn, I don't draw. I'm not an artist. But if I can't figure out how to describe it or how it would look, I can't ask somebody to draw it for me. That's my philosophy.
Interesting. What about you, Fred?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of references important. The basketball book specifically, Joe Cooper drew it, and he's a terrific artist I've worked with. He's worked for a bunch of Marvel DC books. I worked with him on a book called Magnus for Dynamite Comics, which is why I thought he'd be good for this book. So the two things that drove me crazy about this book in terms of reference is color, because like teams' colors change over the decades, and like, is this the right Knicks blue for 1965? And and of course all these photos, half the photos in 1965 are black and white, so you're tearing your hair out trying to figure this out, and trying to find like various college colors. I know what some of this stuff is going to get messed up, but I can just see the angry letters coming in, you know, from
Amazon comments or comments.
Oh my gosh, the 1-star reviews, man, here they come. I can't handle it. No, but the other sort of lucky, if you want to call it a lucky thing, I'm the letterer on my book, and I was the letterer on Action Philosopher. So what's great about being the writer and the letterer is the letterer can tell the writer to go jump in the lake, and you can start cutting lines. Like, nope, don't eat this. Got to fit this into the art and all that stuff. So that's I love lettering. I vastly prefer lettering my own books. I really prefer lettering my own nonfiction comics, because that way I can keep that writer in line. Mr. Talkie, cut it out, you know?
Fascinating. Thank you. And Malika and Tom, I'm curious, kind of as writer artists, how you guys manage this, especially Malika, with you depicting real people in real life in your book. I think that's probably a particular joy or challenge. And Tom, in terms of actually illustrating someone's life and trying to do that in a style that was similar to their own comic making style, that must have been a really interesting journey as well.
Yeah, I mean, it like talking about like drawing people from your life. It's like really interesting drawing people that aren't part of your life, because it's kind of like, you know, Jack Kirby is sort of, you know, fair game. Stan Lee's fair game, but then it's like when I have to, you know, start you know, depicting the various people in their lives, and so it is kind of it's you know, like, you know, you try to tread carefully.
Nerve-wracking.
Yeah, and like, okay, what did his dog look like? You know, I have to draw his dog now. And I couldn't find reference for his dog. So I just kind of like took a guess and drew a dog. And it ended up looking pretty much what I later found some reference after I'd already drawn it, his dog named Dutch. And I found what Dutch, I'm like, oh, I actually didn't do too bad, you know, nailing the look of his dog. And then there's like all the little things, like I know the difference between the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Like, and that's it. Like, I don't know I don't know how the 2000s look different from the 2010s. I don't know how the 50s look different from the 60s, or the 60s look from the 70s, but I know the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So all that other stuff, I have to do somebody's life that starts out in the 1910s and then goes all the way to the 90s. And his story like spans that. It's not like I'm just telling some tiny segment of his life. I'm telling that whole span. So over the course of this graphic novel, I have to have, you know, the 30s turn into the 40s. And it's like, well, what's the difference? It's a very fine, it's, you know, hard to pinpoint. And then the 30s turn into the 40s in the same person's life. And then, you know, you have your house, and the way your house is decorated, it's not like when 1949 turns into 1950, you throw everything out and then refurnish the place. You don't throw out your whole wardrobe. So it's like kind of, you know, making those things happen, you know, a little, you know, organically. And again, like the focus is on like his story and him and the people he meets. So these are like background things, but you're the artist, you have to draw this stuff. So you want to give more thought to the foreground elements, but you still, have to do a lot of like research and thought to those background things.
That's fascinating. And what about you, Malika?
Well, I think I was surprised by how much I had to use so many visual references to draw my own life. Like there's this page in the book where I had to draw the social map of my high school, and I triple fact checked it because I wanted to make sure that the map was accurate, that there
was that popular table.
Yeah, like the Korean American girls sat differently in a different spot from Korean girls from Korea. I needed to make sure that in my mind, as I remembered it, that's exactly where they sat. Also, like pop culture references and eras and how they looked. Like I was into the skater punk style when I was in high school, and I had to look up what a Korn band. Well, Korn isn't really punk, but I looked up what a Korn band what t-shirt looked like, and I drew a Tower Records. I had to remember that. So there was a lot of a surprising amount of research that I had to do to make the visuals as true to life, from hairstyles to pop culture references. In terms of drawing myself, this is really weird, but so many people say that my comic doesn't look like me, or my comic version of me doesn't look like me. I don't know what to say about that. Kristen Radke, who's at The Believer magazine, wrote this really interesting article about how women depict themselves in comics. They don't sexualize themselves. They don't, it's kind of like this ideal version of them. And I kind of just drew myself as the purest essence of my facial expressions. So I think that I did a good job on that. But as far as whether it looks like me, I don't know. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And this is another question for all of you. It's just so interesting to think about how you're taking this very large subject matter and really condensing and curating it down into something that's generally, compared to say a traditional biography or a traditional memoir, traditional, cultural history of something like women's rights or basketball. If taking this big, life or big, movement, big chunk of history and squeezing it down into something smaller. So I'm really curious kind of how you approached, and some of you have sort of touched on this, how do you approach that? What do you keep? What do you leave on the cutting room floor? And I think Mickey talked a little bit about it too when you're writing about history. I actually worked with Mickey on Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists, and the idea that history is not linear and that a person's life is not linear. The history of an institution like basketball, is not a cultural institution, is not linear. Just really curious to get your thinking on how you approach that.
Well, for me, it always starts out with a sort of basic outline or timeline of either the person or the subject that I'm writing about, and then there's a series of questions that I'll ask. It's the same sort of questions that I may have asked when I read about this particular subject anyway, right? So, like an example with Frederick Douglass, there was all these, reports that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman knew each other, but there was no no historical recording of how and where they met. And so to me, it felt like, well, for me, I was obsessed with how did they meet. And that might have been the absolute last thing I was able to put in the book because it took so long to figure it out. But I'll ask questions like, on the Black Panther Party, it was like, okay, if Eldridge Cleaver was in prison when his book was written and published, how did it get published? And so and I break those little chunks into little chunks, and it'll be like, okay, today's the day that I'm researching this particular thing. And the difficult thing now with the pandemic, if I was doing it, it would be like I can't just run to a bookstore, run to the library immediately and grab something. But it's, and of course I read other material. I try to find what are the 3 to 4 essential books on this topic, then go to the bibliographies and see what their resources were, and just start mapping. It's a mess. There's Post-its and index cards all over the place. And then in terms of what gets left out, A lot of times it's something, if I can't quite verify it, it's like if one book says it, but then there's 5 others that don't mention it. Okay, I don't know if I can verify this, or is it appropriate for a particular age group? So with the stuff that we put out through 10 Speed, it's sort of in the young adult range, but I still think of it like, okay, if someone was like, say, 10 years old reading this, like let's keep it as PG-13 as possible, PG-13. And so and therein lied was a big challenge with the Black Panther Party, was just like language, because like they swore a lot, so but yeah, no, it's there's a lot of tough decisions about what stays in and what goes in, and how do you show it, especially if it's dealing with, for me, violence is one of the things that I think about, because it can be an important part of history, but you also don't want to glorify it and make it like this is all that it's about.
Yeah, I'm a sports fan, so when writing about sports, I feel like the first thing that you sort of realize is that I can't compete with the games themselves, like trying to actually represent the excitement of any sort of basketball game in a comic book. Like, no, like why even try? And I also feel like this is the first time I've sort of personally written about sports, but I feel like I was well served by my years and years writing superhero comics, because that's another facet of life where people get obsessed with minutia and arcana. And I've read a bunch of basketball books, and you hear a lot of sports talk people, and it's incomprehensible to the uninitiated. Like they're just they're talking in code. So I wanted to sort of strike a happy medium. So it's a lot of personal stories. You end up talking about, the competition between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. You talk about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's struggle. You talk about Nat Holman with the original Celtics and how he became involved with the point shaving scandal of the late 40s. It's late 40s, I think. Yeah. This is why you must always reread your book before you start doing press for it, which I did not, because I'm bad.
You have time. It's cool.
Well, because that's the other problem, right? When you're writing the comic script, is I finished the book last year to get this line to get drawn. So, but no, it was late. But so yeah, you look for that human element, even if it's not a biography, even if it's something as broad a subject as basketball, you have to find the human element in it, because people are frankly interested in reading about other humans, other people.
Definitely.
Yeah, if I were writing about any other subject or any other person, it would be a very different process. But because this book is Jack Kirby, it's like I know his story. Like I've been, without realizing it, I've been preparing for this book my whole life. Like, and I know his story like really well, just up here. And so my process was sort of, when I was outlining this, was like, okay, I know this happens, I know, and then kind of like, okay, now does this come before this or after the, and so as I get to each point in the story, I'd look things up. I'd know sort of the right questions to ask, which like is very important, and I could have only known those questions just from dealing with like a subject that I already knew really well. If I do another book that's nonfiction or historical, the research process is going to be very different. Like I'm going to have to catch up with whatever that subject or person is. But this I was really at an advantage, just having all this stuff at my fingertips.
Absolutely. And Mickey, your span of history that you covered is, I would say, particularly ambitious. So I'm very curious to hear your answer to this question.
So it was a balancing act, because there were some things where the filter, I had a cursory filter set up that if there was no way to visually represent it, then we weren't going to include it, right? So there was the original filter of it tied to women's fight for their rights. And then the second filter was how could we visually represent it? And then the third level of it, because of that balancing act and because of what I was covering, was coming up with ways to visually represent things like sexual assault, because I included the Recy Taylor case, without it being graphic or glorifying it, but also without shying away from it, what actually happened. Because part of what I believe is that if we don't talk to kids about things that may be happening to them in a way that shows they're not alone, we're doing them a disservice. So we have to include the violence and some of the other things that they may be experiencing without making it seem like those things are okay, but also with making it clear that you are not alone, because that's what I think a lot of kids can feel like without the context of the greater world. And so I tried to craft, and Caitlin, you know this, we had these emails, tried to craft a way where the language was age appropriate and the imagery was age appropriate, but we still depicted the truth so that I could feel good about the history we were teaching, and a parent could feel like they were okay sitting down maybe with their 10 or 12-year-old. Because my advice to people has been largely, this is somewhere between PG and PG-13. Parental guidance is the important part of the conversation if you're talking about kids under 13, and maybe some kids over 13 might need a little extra space to discuss what they're seeing. And I think that that's worked out okay. Parents and kids alike seem okay with it, but it has definitely been kind of this, can we pull it off okay at every step? Because there's just so much to fit in, and so much of history is dirty language and sexual assault and violence and other things. And, you know, I think it's unfair to say to kids, I'm not going to tell you this exists, but I expect you to be able to cope with it when it comes into your world.
And Malika, you're dealing with your own life, which is a really different span of time.
Yeah. One thing that I realized about memoir about halfway into it is that like you're just trying to reveal something about the human experience with like a story of your own personal story. Like in fiction, you reveal it with a character. In nonfiction, you reveal it with some story from your life to say something about love or heartbreak or whatever. And once I figured that, and that seems so obvious, but once that clicked in my mind, I was like, oh, so I want to sort of explain that like I was a pretty lonely high school student and I had no friends. Like, which are the best anecdotes that I could think of in my life that could help illustrate that point? So once I figured that out, it's like really easy to like toss anecdotes aside. Like, oh, what about that time when like the captain of the football team said I was a loser? That's not as good as this other anecdote that I could use instead. So I think that equation worked out really well. The other thing too is that I've been doing so many zines before doing comics, and I'm really used to like very short formats. So I just pretended that the book was 7 zines like tied together, and I just made each chapter. It's like if you read it by itself, it's basically like a mini comic. So that's all I did. I just like crammed them all together and hoped that it like made sense as a book.
I mean, that's no small thing. So, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
We just have a few more minutes before we wrap up. So for our last, point of discussion, I'm curious, kind of highs and lows, what you find the most joy in this work, what is the most exciting thing for you in working on these projects, and what's the hardest part? It doesn't necessarily have to be in that order. But yeah, I'd love to hear that from you guys.
Well,
go on.
Yeah. For me, like I kind of did this work in 2 stages, because I sort of I started it, as its own thing that I was, posting online and working on it very like organically, day by day. And then I sort of built up like a pretty large piece of this book. And then when it starts going into like production as an actual book, then now it goes from being this thing that I'm just doing purely for fun, purely for myself, not giving any thought
All alone.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and no, thinking of nobody but sort of my own like enjoyment making. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, this is the real deal now, and so kind of making that transition into that other where it's like, okay, I have a deadline now. I have like a set endpoint. I have I have to figure out the arc of because up until that point, I was sort of just taking things as they went and not giving a ton of thought into like what this whole big thing's gonna look like. And then all of a sudden I had to sort of figure out the structure, figure out that. So it was two very different kinds of energies, both very productive energies, but very different.
I'll go next. For me, the best part is there's two parts. There's when the art starts coming in and you see this translation of what you've written into the visual. It's always makes me giddy, I guess, for lack of a better term. But hearing from teachers and librarians and even like young people, the impact that the book has had and that they've enjoyed it and that they've gotten something out of it. That's the best feeling I've ever had. It's greater than the feeling I have when someone says, "Oh, I read your Young Justice comic and that was fun." Now, that's great, but this is better. The hard part is that for me during the research phase is I'm immersing myself in these last two books in basically stories of oppression, the fight against oppression, and so it was difficult during the Frederick Douglass book, but during the Black Panther Party, it almost broke me. There were so many members of the party who were killed. There was so much violence, and then contextualizing it within the civil rights movement and all the people who died during the civil rights movement. And there was days where it was just like I can't do this, and I actually warned Marcus beforehand. I said, there's going to be some difficult times because you're going to have to draw some stuff that's difficult. So never hesitate to reach out and we can sort of be in support of each other. And it was, and I remember he reached out to me. There's a section about Emmett Till because that's crucial to the history of civil rights. And he reached out to me when the Emmett Till pages came because he was like, I don't know if I can do this. And I was like, you can. And you need to, and this is why we need to do it. And so there was a lot of that support, and sort of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel that when the book comes out, there's going to be people out there who've never heard of Emmett Till or his mother Mamie Till, and don't understand what his life and death meant in the shaping of this country. It doesn't make it easy, but it's I think it's crucial and important.
Absolutely.
I think for me, the best part in some ways was the research. There's so much you don't know that you don't know until you're really digging into this. And it's really very intense and very exciting. And then on the other side of that, there's the part where you have to make the decisions about what isn't going to make it into the book. Caitlin and I had a lot of, yes, this, no, that, do we keep this? And there might have been some pages that left to me would have had 12 panels. It turns out there is a finite number of panels you can comfortably fit on a page. I'm very upset about that. I'm also very upset that there's a finite number of pages before it's really supposed to be a completely second book. Mm-hmm. But no, so I think I really enjoyed discovering all of this stuff and knowing I would get to share so much. It was just that then trying to edit it down. And then, like David said, some of this is really hard history to look at. And A. D'Amico asked her, the person who drew my book, there are things like the triangle shirt wears fire, where when you turn the page to that or to the lynchings or some of the other things, it's just a punch in the heart, right? And that these things happened and they have to be discussed, and it's integral to the history of how we got to where we are now. And I was trying to weave together labor history and civil rights history and all these other places where women's history comes together without it being a book that either glossed over too much or dragged you so far down you didn't want to keep looking at the pages. And I think that part, just figuring out the balance, is an ongoing thing. And then when you get to the end and you finally have the book, you're like, okay, yay. And then you think of 387 different things you could have done. Maybe that is why you shouldn't look at your book after you write it and someone has drawn it. You should put it over there on the shelf and never touch it again.
Everything I wanted was in that. It was in your book. Just so you know, it was such a good read, and I don't know what you left out. And I think that that's one of the most important things that I have to remind myself of is the readers don't necessarily know what you left out. The history buffs know, but
you did a really beautiful job with Frederick Douglass. I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with the Black Panther book, but I'm going to try.
It's really good, I promise.
I wasn't worried about quality. I was worried about the emotional part.
Definitely a roller coaster. Yeah, I would wait for the right time when you feel ready to read that. Fred or Malika?
I love the research, the detective aspect, the journalistic aspect of running down research. What is much less fun is I dump all the research I use this app called Scrivener, and so it's all in different note cards and stuff. And then I just feel like it feels like fighting a blob with an oar, or like just whacking it over and over again to try and force it into a comic book. That there are some long days that require drinking at the end of them when I'm doing that stage of the book.
Yep.
I think for me, what I love about comics is that you draw the reality that you want, that you imagine. Anything that you want, anything you see, you can draw, and it becomes real. And I think as a kid, I never saw myself represented in anything. I used to look for half Filipino Egyptians in the world, in characters and TV characters and movies and things like that. And I didn't see it, so I just drew myself, and that was it. That's what I love about comics, you know? Whatever you want, it can be.
That is a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That is our time. Really appreciate you being here and sharing your insights with us. Thank you all to the viewers for coming. It's great to have you here. Bye, everyone.